Assalamu alaikum warahmatullahi wabarakatuh. Welcome, dear viewers, to our third episode of Dawah Dojo. Dawah Dojo is intended as a forum to discuss ideas of relevance to the Muslim community, Islam, and the wider Ummah. So we intend this to be a no-holds-barred discussion, transparent discussion. We're happy for you to join us on this journey. Today, we want to discuss the somewhat contentious subject around the issue of the Dawasphere influences and Muslim media, social media presence, the positives, the negatives. And as a synopsis, what we hope to discuss is the fluffers, the bluffers, the wingers, the whingers, the builders, and the blaggers, just to give you an idea to what you're up against. In broad strokes, the idea is we want to go through a spectrum of the kind of people that we encounter. Our thoughts, we want it to be somewhat of a lively discussion, so I don't want to be over-engineering this, but certainly there's been a lot of positive developments. So some of us have been around for some time. Certainly in uni, in my day, there was a lot of talks which are done in person. There wasn't this entire presence. There wasn't internet was in its early days. Things were more propagated around leaflets, audio, cassettes, CDs, and then later various forums, Pal Talk, all this kind of stuff. So, and then before that, Morse code, maybe. But
You really are old, man.
yeah, I can say that to you because you have no frame of reference. You'd be like, yeah, oh yes, and then yes, and the Pegasus that was around as well. So, what you call it? So basically, we want to go through this. So obviously, times have changed, and the social media space changes quite rapidly. And some of us can be quite skeptical of it. However, what we want to do is we want to be quite balanced, and we want to really bring out the positives and the negative. And we always like to end on a positive note, which I'll leave over to Fahim because he's not as jaded as I am. So basically, just to jump into the discussion, I mean, what do you guys think of the Dawah sphere in general? I mean, what are your thoughts? Have you had a good opportunity to acquaint yourselves? What's your overall impression?
I think generally we're in a position that is quite unique, whereby anyone now can use any of these mediums to push a message out and to reach an audience, not just in the UK, but globally. And as a result of that, you've had a lot of people over the past 10 years that have taken positions of providing information. So some of them are very academic and they come from very strong Islamically educated backgrounds, like your Yasser Qadis, for example. You've got some that are very well educated and take quite an alternative type of view, which is like Mufti Abu Layth. And then you've got standard da'is that come up and they have their own views there. The good thing about it is that all of these individuals, whether they're connected to groups or not, are attempting to push the idea or attract people to, first of all, the Tawheed of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and secondly, referring to the Quran and Sunnah as an evidence for actions and for beliefs. So it's a very good basis. But I think where the issue comes following that is the interpretation that can be pushed forward, agendas that people can be connected to, and a sort of dismissiveness and elitism whereby only their view is correct and everyone else is wrong. So I think there's a positive, but there are also some areas that could be worked on.
Actually, I have contention with you on one thing. I mean, immediately, I didn't. You mentioned Mufti Abu Layth. So, for example, most people will have issue with him. Now, I don't get into whether validity or not necessarily, but normally when you if you say about the people who provide deep content, there's quite a number of names, but it's just interesting because he's a name that often is associated with quite out there type of views, bordering on the kind of secularist type of paradigm. I don't know him well enough, but on some of the stances he's taken on riba, because this was actually going to be part of the subject matter, which is a lot of people have got into somewhat of a culture of rebuttal, because there's a number of names. For example, you do have Yasser Qadhi. He's definitely got a lot of knowledge. definitely.
Mm.
Omar Suleiman, I mean, for him, you mentioned him quite frequently in terms of how much of a positive impact he's had. But at the same time, you've got people who rebuttal people that of his stance. But I'm just going to put Abu Layth on the back burner because I think there is probably some considerably valid critique there. But bringing it back
I would
to,
say there is.
Yeah,
there's definitely some critique there. But the reason why I include him into the mix is because he's like on one of the extremes of it. He comes from quite a good academic Islamic background. Some of his views are quite unique and on the fringe, but he does try to support them with evidence. I'm not saying that that's someone that I support, but it's someone who comes from more of an academic background than perhaps your Ali Dawahs, who are more, Da'i type as opposed to Islamically educated.
I think Abu Layth is actually a really good example about this whole topic in general, because regardless of like the views themselves or the fringe that he tends to sit on sometimes, he's like a classic case of someone who's blown up through this medium that we're talking about. And he's one of those like key representatives, almost you can say, of the online Dawah scene, whether you agree or disagree with him, right? He's like one of those classic cases of showing you the effect of this type of world and this online Dawah sphere. I think my general perspective on it is if we look at it as a whole, it's a natural progression. This was inevitable. It was always going to come. In the 1930s and 40s and 50s, it was radio that was the big issue. You had scholars from Al Azhar University and scholars from around the world debating, should we put the Quran on the radio, right, for people to hear? Should we be using, because new technology like radio, there's a lot of bad that can come out from it, or a lot of good that can come from it, right? And then in the like 70s to the 90s, it was the cassette tapes, right? And a good example of someone who's a bit more forward thinking and ahead of his time was Sheikh Ibn Uthaymeen, rahimahullah, who was a big advocate of using cassette tapes. And that there's a lot of stories that are told from him that some of his students bought cassette tapes to his halakas, and he asked about what this was. He didn't know what cassette tape was. And they said it's a recording device, so we can record your lectures. And when he heard this, he actually advocated very strongly for people to do this. So the knowledge didn't stay within Saudi Arabia or Buraida or wherever they were learning, that it could be disseminated as far as possible. And I think the online Dawah sphere and the internet is just that natural progression now. It's just our era's version of that. And I think it's a lot more nuanced as a whole thing. I think there's always going to be good that comes from it, and there's always going to be bad from it. These type of like technologies provide like a level of freedom to individuals that a madrasa doesn't and an institute doesn't, because they have a strict like vetting process and like you have to meet certain criteria in order to voice your opinion or to teach certain things. Where these type of technologies, they're open for anyone as long as you know how to use it, right? You can almost find your place, within there. And I think naturally, you're going to get people who use it for good and people who use it for bad. And even the people who maybe use it for bad, I don't think their intentions start out that way. I think they start out being nefarious or want to use it to spread like evil things or anything. It's just another mechanism for them to have outreach.
I mean, with the whole idea of social media, I mean, for example, take X as an example, or Twitter. Sorry, Elon, your money's been wasted. Twitter. The idea of it being a town square. So town square, you can go to our local town square, and if we have one still, you can have all sorts there. But in the same way, it doesn't have this vetting mechanism. But the other thing is also, sometimes you have the opportunity to have the strongest ideas that dominate. But because it's so much noise out there, the strongest ideas don't always dominate. At the same time, it starts to become overpopulated with just noise. And then you have issues of controversy more like for the sake of it. Like I see every so often, like some controversy about some influence or something. I'm too old to know who these people are. Oh, so-and-so did this. I don't care. It's almost like my take on a Kardashian is a Jurassic Park school, which if you're the T-Rex, you just sit still and ignore it and it'll go away. That's how I want to treat these Kardashians and any of these kind of Muslim name type of sensationalists, husband-wife teams who suddenly fall out of sorts. So that's just a bit of a segue. But sometimes you've got the dross, but there's also the thing whereby you've got people taking on quite heavy subjects and being overcritical. But this is the thing here. You mentioned, for example, people not starting out nefarious. Agreed. But at the same time, sometimes we need to accept that our mindsets or how we approach certain things themselves are implicitly quite either mired in a point of view which is divisive, or somewhat unbeknownst to themselves, somewhat secularized. So last session,
Yep.
I mentioned, for example, about a madrasa brother who's brought up the subject of khilafah to his madrasa. I think they're bandis, and their response was, look, because they were decimated, they don't want to broach this subject at all. Then there's a whole issue of suppressing news, suppressing things of politics, and politics being an integral part of our deen. Because actually, I'm gonna fast forward a second as well. Sorry, I'm hogging the spotlight here, but I'm gonna fast forward here because somebody can have all the knowledge, however, there's conspicuous silence. So take, for example, Mufti Menk. At a time where bombs are raining down on children, I have seen more dead children than I ever wanted to see in my life. Many years ago, when Bosnia happened, I remember VHS tapes, again, going back to the history, now you got it in Twitter, VHS tapes by a brother called Abdul Malida of Bosnia, and you seeing grainy footage of dead people, burnt bodies and everything. What we've seen now, high definition, dead children. Now, I don't know how hard your heart must be to not even attribute that to the perpetrator. I don't know what kind of a person you are to not even, because look, what is your dawah? It's like this. If I imagine I say, I'm building up, I'm really making a huge banquet and you're starving. But I'm saying, nah, bruv, I'm waiting for like the charcuterie or whatever that is. And there's a great ice sculpture I've got in the middle of this banquet, but you're starving. And by the time I deliver this banquet, you're dead. This is the kind of celebrity scholarship we have. On the one hand, you've got somebody, you've got the people. I've gone way ahead. I've quantum leaped ahead. But
Yeah,
you've got your people who don't even have the spine under this perception of we need to protect the Dawah, or we have a greater objective. I call it the Scooby-Doo. The Scooby-Doo plan. They've got this great Scooby-Doo plan, and you just don't know because you're just too naive. I don't buy this because there's something I need to see working out. I need to see you working out. How did you come to this conclusion?
well, this is a key point here. If I can just jump in for a second, it comes down to intentions, and our actions are judged by intentions. And sometimes an individual may think they have a particular intention, but that can morph and it can develop, and it can change, as you say, with this personality aspect that comes into it. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says that He knows as-sir wa aghfa. So what is as-sir? As-sir is a secret. That's something that only you know. Someone else knows it. It's not a secret, right? As-sir are the things that only you know. Al-aghfa can be interpreted as those things deep within oneself that you're not aware of until you actually look back retrospectively. And that can often be related to your intention. So you do something for a particular purpose, and when you look back, you realize, well, hang on a second, there are a number of different other intentions that were behind what I did that I wasn't aware of at the time. But looking back, was it actually purely for the sake of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? I think that people can start with an intention of ibadah and spreading knowledge, but there is this sort of like cult of personality that develops, and with that there's a desire, then a self-interest to maintain your position, and with that not to talk about particular controversial issues that could get you silenced, that could stop you getting invited to certain areas, or things that could actually be seen as quite controversial. Also, we have to bear in mind within the past 20 years that there's been a number of legislation that's been drafted to particularly silence certain topics within political arenas, specifically Islamically. So that could be one of the reasons why people don't engage in certain talking about certain topics. I think topics can be raised, in a lawful manner without drawing any unnecessary repercussions to oneself. But there are a lot of people that want to maintain a particular position of giving people information that makes them feel good, is happy and entertaining, you know, the surface level of Islam as opposed to the deeper. Fahim, I know you wanted to jump in.
Yeah, I completely agree. I think from my personal perspective, a lot of like the critique, how I see it, on whether it's Mufti Menk or whoever, you know, on that side, a lot of it is speculation in terms of like from our end of the exact reasons and nuances why he carries himself the way he does and why he chooses to talk about something and doesn't talk about something, right? For me, I'm like, at the end of the day, right, I can critique it based on the outward in terms of like, okay, if I feel, or if there's a general consensus feeling that he's not been as vocal on a certain thing as he should be, we can absolutely critique that. But I think a deeper thing that lies, and it's not unique to Mufti Mank, and it's not, I think it's a symptom of the entire environment, is what, you know, is that cult of personality. You know, I think it's a real problem that almost like develops itself. It kind of handicaps, I think, some of these da'is and imams themselves, that when they get to this level of people follow more for the personality than the actual information that's being told to them, it really limits what you can and can't say to begin with. Because then if you start to delve into something that's a bit more controversial or something that's a bit more detailed, right, you're going to alienate a lot of your audience that way. And if you're as big as someone like Mufti Menk, right, don't get me wrong, he's done a lot of good, right, and he's had a, you know, a big impact for a lot of Muslims out there, you know, different, you know, levels. But when you have a brand that's, I'm not saying this as a justification, by the way, but just to say, when you have a brand as big as his, when you're probably, your income is as big as his, and your outreach is, what you can and can't say is very, probably, you know, there's a long list, you know, of certain things. Regarding Palestine specifically, I don't know how that would fit in terms of like, you see probably the, you know, a lot of these other big, you know, guys like, you know, Musliman and etc. still being completely vocal, you know, with the massive, you know, reach that they have, a massive audience that they have, being, you know, non-stop talking about this issue. But I think like a greater issue with this whole thing is definitely just the fine line. I feel like, again, this whole Dawah sphere, online Dawah sphere, there's a lot of problems with it. Like, don't get me wrong, there's a lot of problems. I'm probably segueing now, probably a little bit more ahead anyway. One of them is definitely this celebrity environment that's, you know, like created almost in many ways, in the sense that there's so many imams, there's so many da'is, there's so many scholars, right, that are completely unheard of, but it's the ones on the online sphere that, you know, that get known. And when this environment of celebrity kicks in, it becomes very like confusing, you know, how to navigate it almost, you know, like it goes beyond this idea of like, people are no longer coming for the information that's being told, but the representative that is being bought from. And that, you see, can lead to so many problems. There's so many like scandals, even, you know, things that end up happening. And that's because at the end of the day, shaitan is always there, you know, in the sense that once you do get the popularity, right, it's, you know, like, it's a scary thing. I think, you know, when you get that popular, some like Omar Salman and these guys, right, everything is so magnified on you. Every little mistake is magnified, you know, 10 times, 20 times. So the smallest mistakes you make, right, are going to be like, you know, blown out of proportion. And then you have the counter, which is what you mentioned before, is then we have people nitpicking every little thing. Their whole identities, they've gone to, some of them are even very learned. Some of them are very, like, they studied at an institute, or they studied, you know, for 5, 6, 7+ years, and they've come out of it, and all they're doing is making rebuttal videos. And that's pretty much the culmination of what their dedication to Talib al-Ilm was. It was to end with this segment of now just creating rebuttal videos to how everyone's wrong and a deviant, and this one's made a mistake and that mistake, and yeah.
You know the hadith, sorry, the saying, calibre al-haq yuridu bihi batil. That comes into play here, in a sense that sometimes, so basically, someone says a truthful word, but the intention behind it is invalid, is something nefarious. So sometimes you have some of these rebuttal videos with a nefarious intention. Because I remember, for example, in the DAO, before personalities were issued, it was groups were a prominent feature. And you'd always have certain common culprits whose only purpose was to denigrate. And to build this mentality, it's not just nitpicking. Where they couldn't critique you, they would build a narrative where you can't even be engaged with. So this is another thing. So, for example, you have those who are overzealous in their critique, nitpicking. Sometimes when that doesn't work, because effectively the social media sphere has leveled the playing field. Yeah, in many ways it's positive. As an example, if you take the algorithm of Palestine, Sami Hamdi makes an excellent point. He says that the amount of people that are sharing on the issue of Palestine has circumvented all these algorithms. So whereas the BBC News, they pulled a Mufti Menk, yeah? Sorry, I'm going to say it. In the BBC News, by magic, people in Palestine are dying. Yeah, it's by magic. Because if I look at BBC News, it's by magic because it's happened. They died. An Israeli hasn't killed them. It happened by magic. Mufti Menk, when he says something, it's by magic. Oh, it's really bad. This happened. Oh, that's really bad. But without digressing, so the social media sphere has effectively made this level playing field so that the message, the positive, massive positive, the message of Palestine is getting out. It's impossible to suppress. Same way, you have a Dawasphere whereby somebody may not be totally qualified or adequately qualified, but they are having their voice out there. In some ways, it could be an actual a fault of the people who are more knowledgeable to not have addressed it, or to not have been in this space. But at the same time, when they do, even when they do show their face, so for example, like them or it's another discussion about. I'd say, for example, Dr. Yasser Qadi and Haytham Al-Hajj, they've done a couple of videos. I've done it with the Sheikh on discussing some of the issues, and they've actually have gone into this area. And they have put certain what they consider to be practical things. Because sometimes on the dissenting side, I know, Fahim, you mentioned this to me, because I'm too old for this stuff. You mentioned this phenomenon of the woke imams to me. Yeah. So I don't know what that means, but I still don't. but the way you sold it to me is it's basically a Salafi light. They're like they're Islamic, but they're trying to navigate the West. And in some respect, the pendulum went too far, as what I recall. See, I was paying attention. So the pendulum went too far, but so the critique, the backlash has been, okay, you guys are watered down too much. And then that's where a lot of the nitpicking has come, but with good intentions.
Yeah, I think it's the idea of apologetics. Now, Sheikh Hatem Al-Hajj has a good small video series on the Yaqeen Institute channel where he talks about this concept of apologetics, and he goes through what the criteria is, how far can we go, and the training in that and all that stuff. It's a good example of the perspective. I think the whole term woke imam or compassionate imam is kind of like a term that came out from detractors, essentially, right? That these imams are maybe focusing more on certain issues like matters of the heart and daily life and spirituality, and they're not really addressing what some might consider the tougher topics to talk about, or the more the political stuff or the khilafah stuff, or even even matters within fiqh, for example, that are up for debate and maybe a bit more contentious. They'll kind of stay away from those things, and then also they'll maybe, when it comes to topics like LGBTQ movements or engagement with wider society, whether you're in America or Canada or US, the detractors will say that they're too lenient, or that they're too apologetic, or they're made too many concessions. And then the downside to that is, cool, while they helped a lot of people who struggled with a lot of aspects, coming to terms with a lot of aspects of Islam, and they managed to hold on to them, when it's time to now talk about, because you can't stay in that realm forever, as a Muslim, eventually you will have to talk about stuff that's a bit tougher or a bit more controversial, right? Then the detractors will say you've done yourself a disservice now, because you've not trained these people to then come to terms with all this other stuff. You focused on the nice, happy heart stuff and all this sort of jazz, but when it then came to the hard stuff, then they kind of blame them. I don't agree fully with the critique, but they blame them for the next generation of Muslims that are more secular, or they say that they're the next generation of Muslims who come out with like arguments and positions for why we should support certain movements like LGBT stuff and secular movements with Palestine. And they blame essentially this whole concept of woke and woke imam in the West, basically, you know, this whole environment.
Do you think part of that
Well,
is this? Sorry.
No. So while I do understand the critique, and to a degree, I would say they're right. Again, I think this just falls within the whole spectrum. It's just an approach at the end of the day, you know, because all the imams in the West are all navigating relatively the same issues. They're all trying their best to try and, you know, get Muslims to hold on to their faith, get Muslims to hold on to Iman, and just keep the boat going, essentially, right? Some may make more concessions than others based on their ijtihad and based on their understanding, where they think it's okay to do this. I think that's like a whole like separate topic in itself, you know, maybe for another time. But I think all of this is just a natural result from when you give the freedom for anyone to have a voice. You know, you mentioned social media a lot of the time, right? Like Twitter and stuff. I've always been firm. I think Twitter is a cesspool of of bad ideas. Like
I like to contribute to that.
Two places which are the cesspools of bad ideas in terms of like religious understanding and knowledge and stuff is Reddit and Twitter. Like it's just absolute like a horror show over there. And that's just again an outcome of everyone having a voice. You know, anyone can say anything, right? So you have a lot of people who fall for a lot of nonsense views because there's no real like filter, and there's no real like filtering mechanism to check these type of views unless someone takes the initiative to go and verify these views. I may be wrong, but I would say most of the people on social media are not doing that, hence why they're taking their Islam from social media. Now, it's a double-edged sword because most of, I would say, people under 30 are probably taking their Islam nowadays from social media of some sort, right? Whether it's Twitter, whether it's Instagram, whether it's YouTube, they're not really going to books. They're not really going through the old movement style of things, of the leaflets and the pamphlets and the books. They're not, you know, we know from the work we're trying to do, the attention span of the modern person is very low, right? They can barely get through, you know, a 10 to 15-minute video, let alone read a 300-page book about a topic in Islam or, you know, in Islamic science. So it's an uphill battle in the sense that it's one of those things I feel like it's just a sign of the times, and that either you adopt or you'll get left behind.
Exactly.
And I think,
well, this
go ahead, man.
This is a really good point, because it also depends on the level of interest that people have.
Yeah.
For a lot of the viewers, it's entertainment, right? So they'll flick on to watch some kind of an Islamic chat that's taking place, or, you know, a speech or a show that's being presented by certain da'is. They might want to have a laugh and look at Speaker's Corner and just see like heated debates. But the content generally, and I think when there are disagreements and differences of opinion, that's where there may be more of a prompting for the audience to do some research and start looking into things, because they'll start to realize, right, there is a difference of opinion here. Where is this difference coming from? And what sources can we start to look at? And I think that sets quite a good precedent, because then we're understanding that the deen is not cultural as it was about 20 years ago. It's actually based on knowledge. So, for example, an understanding of the Quran and Sunnah, an understanding that there is a usul al-fiqh and there are differences of opinion that exist there. So I think social media and da'is and this platform has led to a great increase in knowledge, especially with access to the internet. I mean, now you got the whole of Sahih Bukhari, Muslim, Tirmidhi, Namajas, and Abu Dawood at your fingertips. You know, you can verify things if you want to, and you can go into classical books. More of them are being translated from Arabic into English. And I think also, to cover one of the points that Rush mentioned, which is, you know, mubtadi'ah and this censoring, meaning don't sit or refer to these particular people because they're not on the correct manhaj. And obviously this is coming from a very protectionist angle, where there's a prepackaged version of what is considered acceptable Islam, and anyone who veers from that very slightly, even if it is based on a legitimate difference of opinion, they're considered mubtadi'ah. They should be shunned. It's almost taken to the level of al-wala wal-bara, which doesn't actually apply to mubtadi'ah. It's applying to clear cases of iman and kufr. But again, why is that pushed? Why is there such a need for that? And generally, it's because you've got a certain ideology that you want to push. And as you say, focusing on spirituality and getting Tawheed correct and, getting people worshipping. But the main place where this has been pushed, which is obviously from Saudi Arabia, behind that there was a big political agenda and funding internationally. Why? Most of the youth are not fully interested in Islam, and many of them are engaging in Halloween parties. And I remember very clearly when the Salafis were pushing, whoever celebrates the celebrations of the disbelievers is one of them. I mean, fair enough. Like, saying happy birthday to someone makes you a disbeliever, wearing a suit instead of a thobe. But what about when you're actually celebrating? I don't know what could be worse than Halloween. Ghouls and ghosts and shayateen and dressing like one and imitating them. But Saudi Arabia, full steam ahead, go ahead. So it's very interesting when you look at the areas they won't talk about, which is what Rush has indicated, because they're too controversial or it's not on the agenda. Stick to spirituality, but then you're celebrating and encouraging Halloween parties.
I mean, you mentioned intention there. I would say you mentioned intention there. I'd say the intention of not your rank and file and individuals, but the people who are pushing this narrative was never good. One of the best panaceas for a lot of this stuff, like previously I mentioned about confluences, the con artists, like the Shahid Bolsons, sorry, I had to get his name in there, is pick up a history book. So this entire narrative around pure Aqidah and all this stuff, it was weaponized by Abdulaziz ibn Saud, who weaponized there's fantastic deep dives on this. There's one I can send you, but basically it goes through the entire history. But it was weaponized by this nefarious tribal leader Abdulaziz, using the Wahhabi doctrine, actually doing khuruj against the Ottomans, and basically de facto secularized, allowing them to secularize the region. So basically, make it just as long as you're ibadah or what they call tawheed. Again, I don't call it tawheed. It's a selected understanding of tawheed. It's a definition which itself, is not absolute by Abdul Wahhab, to then run roughshod over others. And then, so when they say, for example, don't sit with the muqtada, it's because somebody else is going to critique you and say, this ruler is ruling by kufr, or this person is takfiri and divisive, or this is another acceptable point of view. By you putting, for example, he's a mubtadi. So I mean, I always use the same analogy, which is this: our prophet sat with Abu Jahl to discuss. So you're saying you can't talk to another Muslim. However, Abu Jahl, the Prophet ﷺ, your own prophet, can sit and discuss with someone like Abu Jahl. So what is really happening here is that they want to retain a level of power. And the other positive thing about social media, and even, for example, you might have the trash, is the fact that you have an opportunity to discuss every kind of idea under the sun. And even as cesspool-y as Twitter may be, in a single thread, you can have an entire discussion on a given issue. It could be about Palestine. It could be about the issue of Tawheed. It could be an issue about rulers. You will see an entire thread, so that the public can become educated as to what's happening. There was, for example, a forum, Muntada, where there was discussion on the issue of ruling by kufr, and whether there's this whole bolt-on that the Madkhalis have put on about the issue of kufr duna kufr, completely demolished in this thread. They actually closed it down, but basically showing that it's not a connected thread. It's not Ibn Abbas. So long story short, basically,
absolutely. It's allegedly attributed to Ibn Abbas, which is incorrect. Ibn Abbas never even said that. And even if you look at the report, what it relates to, it doesn't even apply via analogy to what the rulers are doing at this point in time. It's very different, but they use that. Another thing that they use as a sort of excuse is, oh, it's not kufr unless the person who is legislating clearly states that they believe that it is acceptable to do, or that it is better than the Sharia of Allah. Now, the question is, we have clear-cut evidence that it is kufr at a certain level. وَمَنْ لَمْ يَحْكُمْ بِمَا أَنزَلَ اللَّهُ فَأُولَٰئِكَ هُمُ الْكَافِرُونَ. We know that it's a clear principle of Tawheed, that the one that can legislate and act to be good or permissible or prohibited, and to enact punishment in this dunya or akhirah, or reward or punish, is only Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. So the question would be, you agree with that, because that's the fundamental basis of the deen. You can't escape that. And it's covered in An-Nawaqid by Muhammad ibn Abdul Wahhab, and Ibn Taymiyyah wrote about it a lot. So now if you want to escape it and say, well, it's only kufr when the individual who's doing it states clearly that he believes that it is permissible, the response to that would be, okay, now where do you get your evidence to say that that is a condition that must be clearly understood before the ruling that Allah has clearly given in the Quran is made applicable? And they struggle to provide any evidence for that because it just doesn't exist.
And that's the beauty of closing our discussion. Just don't discuss with that person. And they don't have, that's why, for example, in the social media sphere, these kind of people are being bashed, really bashed.
I would argue that even these type of issues, like, again, are so specialized that social media is not the place to have these type of discussions, in my perspective. Now, you may very well disagree with it in terms of Twitter is not a place to go into such in-depth discussions, right? Because again, when you have these type of discussions in a real environment, a professional setting, where the purpose of it is to really engage in knowledge, there's a level of moderation, there's a level of respect, there's a level of keeping things under control, right? And it's, hopefully it's all about the evidences and the information, where there's none of that moderation. It's all down to people's, individual perspective, whatever they want to say, right? And again, it always turns out to be a bashing session, people calling you deviant, and it just reminds me of the statements of Abu Hanifa, rahimahullah, why he left the whole debating aspect of Aqidah, is because he goes, ultimately, what it became was, I'm paraphrasing here, but Abu Hanifa said, when I would debate someone on Aqidah and belief, I approached it in the thing that they were right and that they could be wrong, right? No, sorry, the opposite way. That they were wrong from the perspective, but there was always a hope that they was right. But he goes, now you kind of just do debating to make each other a kafir. You hope everyone's wrong, and you hope everyone is, outside the fold. And it's just, that's essentially like a modern day manifestation. But I would even argue that what we're experiencing is there's not unique. It's not different. It's just on a more active scale. That these type of arguments, like we know in history, madhabism, people setting fire to people's homes and driving them out of cities and towns and all this sort of stuff because of them holding different views, or them making a critique of a certain imam or a certain scholar or stuff, right? None of this stuff is different than in human history. I think what the internet has done is it's just made everyone hyper connected, and all these instances are just, they feel more common, they feel more frequent just because we're exposed to them way more. Right? Before in history, where it was just localized to wherever that person was studying, whatever it was in that region, now everyone has access to it. I think at the end of the day, you can never get rid of it. You'll never be able to get rid of this side of it, of the superficial aspect of it, where it's just debating, where it's just causing, like some X saying he's a deviant, Y saying he's a deviant, all this sort of stuff. That will always exist. And if I'm being honest with you, I actually think the amount of people in that is less than actual real people trying to disseminate Islamic knowledge in the online world. But obviously controversy will always get more clicks. That voice is always the loudest, so it will always raise to the top, even though it's not the most amount. And there's so many institutes, so many, even madrasas, even so many mosques who are joining social media platforms to disseminate their knowledge. But at the end of the day, a lot of these algorithms will always push the controversial aspects. That's what will always get clicks. And there's a level of innate, the word I would use is like tribalism inside of humans, right?
Yes.
And it takes different forms, where 1,000+ years ago, it was your lineage and your people and all this stuff. And we still have that manifestation even today in parts of the world. another version of that is your Islamic allegiances, right? Whether you call yourself a Salafi, whether you call yourself a Shia or a Sunni or whatever it may be, a lot of this internet stuff has just allowed this to proliferate even more. It's when people find a group that they think they belong in, then the battles will happen. You know, they'll defend it and they'll just call each other like Mubtadi or whatever they want to say. I think ultimately you can never eradicate it, but I think the onus again is on the people who see it as a problem need to again lead by example. They need to do something about it.
Do you also think that?
I think they are overall. Sorry, I know I'm going on for a little bit here, but I think they are. At the end of the day, it's up to scholars and it's up to imams, it's up to new institutes and madrasas just to keep going, to keep putting the information, because I do believe at a certain level for the people who are genuinely interested in learning, that superficial debate stuff, it will plateau. It won't be enough for them anymore, right? They'll reach a point where they'll actually need to satiate that hunger for actual real learning. And the speakers corner stuff, while it's good in some aspects, I'm not going to be biased totally and say like no good has come out of it. Absolutely, there's some good that has come out of it. I'm just not a fan of the sensationalism and the celebrity aspect, and then the back and forth of, you know, like what's the main critiques? Like, okay, that, funny enough, what we're doing, but they, you know, these rogue Islamic podcasts where people doing all sorts of stuff and having all sorts of perspectives and weird stuff. At the end of the day, you can never make it. The internet will always have that.
I've got a couple of questions on this as well. So there's one for example, the burnout, where people will naturally filter out, either become moderate their views or become more secular. The other is you've described the desire to get deeper knowledge. There's also the other perspective. So things can have their part. So for example, the speaker's corner type of vibe, if managed properly, it could be somewhat of a conveyor belt. Someone's new, they want to see two ideas battle it out so they can formulate a decision. And then in the same way, like a revert, Jim Lee, for example, you've gone through a journey yourself. You can see firsthand in terms of how you started, how you gravitated towards certain views, and then later as you acquire more knowledge, you adopt something else. Do you see this as kind of because the thing is, I do personally think there's considerable merit in having information out there, and those people who know should take it upon themselves to really to produce material palatable to the masses and also publish everything. So for example, building a deeper level of conviction, because I think one of the worst things possible is to have this clergy mentality. Like for example, recently, for example, there's a video a brother did on the issue of kalam. Now it's way over my head, I'm not even pretending to understand it, but it's picking apart certain fundamental, some flaws which people have taken dogma as dogmatically, and not being able to go toe to toe with kufr. Now, you know, it's haqq and batil will always be at each other. The deen, for example, time of Rasulullah sallallahu the Quran, you know, the last juz is replete with examples of, for example, discussing with the Quraysh. Example of Ibrahim alayhi salam when he talks about the son, this is my Lord, and then it sets. You know, he was effectively demonstrating to the people that my Lord is not one that can diminish, can set. The point is there'll always be some kind of argument and counter argument. So that kind of playing field has its place, and building a Muslim. So, for example. So I keep going in segues, but a Muslim who's brought up culturally will never have a deep level of understanding. So these kind of venues provide that. So something rather than just hiding. For example, somebody once mentioned on the issue of teaching people issues of the Kalam, they said, if we teach in our madrasa, we'll have people who apostatize. That to me should be just an alarm bell. The fact that you don't have people equipped to deal with this, you're just going to sweep it under the carpet.
Well, this is exactly it. If I can jump in.
Social media is basically, you can't hide here. You can't hide. So it's better to get ahead of it rather than hide it. Sorry, Jamil.
Yeah. There's a lot of good points that have come out in what we've said there. So there is definitely the human tribal aspect. And don't forget, we're humans, and humans do have a lot of ego, right? I think as Fahim mentioned, there is a tribalism. It could be football, it could be based upon race. There's always an us and them. and there's often I want to defend my position that I'm holding on to, which is ego based. Okay, and with that, you can hold it. This will naturally come about when there are differences of opinion, and we have to accept that in Islam, from the Islamic texts, there are different ways in which they can be interpreted and understood. There is ikhtilaf. So the question is, well, how do we deal with ikhtilaf? Is it something where we take a position of my opinion is more valid than yours and it's superior? You don't understand what I'm on, and you're an innovator, or is there an understanding of, okay, this is a view based upon an interpretation of a text of which it is open to differences of opinion, and this should be accepted and understood without the level of judgment that's there. So what will happen is people will naturally start to develop and grow. If they're sincere. If they're not, they'll hold on to their position and they'll stick to it and they won't grow and develop. So again, it comes down to the sincerity, right? If someone has a view and that view is challenged or questioned with evidence, then that person should look at that evidence and understand it. And even if that is outside of Islamic doctrine, so you're talking about kalam and all of these terms that we're using, and I mean this is how there is a level of control that takes place, and name throwing, because when you throw a name out on a person, a label, in Islam, it generally implies.
So you're breaking up a bit.
Yeah. So, for example, Muslim is Muslim is different to Kafir. Can you hear me?
You keep breaking up a bit. Are you hearing that?
Can you hear me?
Fahim,
he's breaking up. Yeah, he's breaking.
Okay, I'll talk a bit, and if I break up, just tell me and someone else can jump in.
Okay, cool.
But what I'm talking about here is the use of labels and names, because in Islam, once you apply a certain label or name, certain rights normally follow. So Muslim, Mu'min, Mushrik, Mulhid, Kafir, Murtad, all of these names apply certain rights. So you call someone a Khariji, you call someone a Murji, you call someone an innovator. It's very easy to throw names that don't actually apply just because you think they might, because of one or two things that you've seen. And it's a means of control. But quite rightly, if someone is interested in areas of kalam, they're normally classified as being mu'tazili or rationalists, and then they're moved along a certain scale. But again, this is something that's happened particularly in Saudi Arabia as well, with certain scholars who have been moved from the position of Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah and been pushed to the angle of being labeled as Khariji, and those that were originally Murji'ah have now been pushed to the level of Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah. And behind all of that, you've got political involvement, you've got salaries that are being paid, and you've got deep levels of oppression, to the extent that one of the scholars in the Haram just made a simple statement during the Friday khutbah, and he received 10 to 20 years imprisonment. So there is a level of control there, but Islam is not prepackaged, and we should move away from this Vatican idea that anyone who speaks against our tone is considered a deviant. There should be, as far as I'm concerned, all arguments should be put forward and considered, and they should be rebutted. And if there is a particular framework and restriction based on the Quran and Sunnah, it should be applied. But if it's not there, it shouldn't be forcibly placed.
You bring up a very important issue here. And that is, firstly, is how did this narrative come to the fore whereby a state has that level of control and authority to actually define what Islam is? And whenever state involvement is involved, the state is involved, it's going to be nefarious because power corrupts. Secondly, is in terms of the responsibility on people who know. So, for example, people may object to me saying about somebody being too passive and too not indulging in certain issues, but this is the upshot of that. If everyone is going to be quiet, whereas as a believer, if you know something, there is a greater responsibility. If you're the awam, you don't know something, or you're not in a position doesn't it make a greater responsibility on the person to speak out? Because if, for example, we have expectations of a imam to have half decent recitation, etc., etc., wouldn't it be more important to insist on a level of principles and speaking the truth? This is a bit of a segue, but I do personally think that I'm not a person who can give a pass to someone who can be that quiet, because there is more to this than that. You've got the phenomenon of government scholars, you've got entire states that promote a type of Islam which is anathema. So I want to cover this topic in a future point about the whole idea of UAE Islam.
Yeah, I think these are good topics that can be covered going into a future perhaps conversation. But it's quite clear that the point is that if we put a responsibility on people and say, well, we expect more of you, I think you have to look at that individual's particular situation. You have to look at where they are based. You have to look at the restrictions that could be placed upon them, because even from an Islamic perspective, you're not obliged to engage in certain statements or acts if there are particular sanctions that could be placed against you. An example of that, for example, if you look at like the Hajj guides, right? So you used to get them from Regent's Park Mosque back in the 90s. And it will tell you how to perform Hajj or Umrah. And at the back of it, it would have the things which nullify the religion. And among that, it would be ruling by other than what Allah revealed. And it would say whoever does that is a disbeliever. So the scholars would give the ruling without applying it mu'ayyin individually to a specific person. That was the climate that was permissible then. Now it's obviously been tightened up a bit.
What I mean is that, for example, in a place where you're not incapacitated, when you can speak, there is a greater responsibility. Sorry for him, Karen.
No, so to bring it back a little bit back to the topic of the other video in the Dawasphere, yeah, all these individuals aside in terms of what they're doing and how much they choose to speak about X, Y, and Z, I think ultimately, like, if I have any view on anything, I would say the culture of this, like, fighting and infighting, that happens online, or picking each other apart, looking for problems, looking for like nitpicking, like mistakes, and being so incredibly judgmental about everything, that needs to die down, right? That needs to, like, I know it's very much easier to say that than its application. It will always exist again because of drama, but I feel the Dawasphere, that is doing us a disservice. Even if the people who are making these videos think they're doing something good from this, and they're doing something honorable by making these videos, highlighting these mistakes, right? It's not, we're not as Muslims here to be like so nitpicky about every single person, like, and every little thing that happens. Sure, when something happens and you can advise someone, you advise them, right? But it's not to be all up in everyone's business and completely highlighting everyone's mistakes and just being on top of everyone like that. I think ultimately going forward, for the next generation of a youth, the next generation of students of knowledge and scholars and future scholars, is they have to get with the times, is one thing. They have to be able to, they all have to just join the social media sphere. And I think it's a case of you almost drown out the noise and the rubbish when you provide alternatives for people to watch, right? Because people aren't attending the masjid, which is the truth. They're not attending the masjid. They're not attending halakas at people's houses or at venues or anything. The max they'll get to is like an event of someone who's well known, like a Sami Hamdi, like a Yasir Qadi, Sheikh Akram, all these type of people, and they're already on the social media sphere, doing their work, as well. But ultimately, I think it's a case of just people who feel passionate about this, who want to fix kind of the culture that's being, presented in the online Muslim Dawasphere, is that everyone just has to, on an individual basis, take up the responsibility. You have to be on the online sphere, you have to be creating the content, and you have to, again, provide the alternative for people. I think we have enough infighting as it is, as Muslims, with all the views. We don't need any more Medina graduates and Azhar graduates and Western people just making back and forth videos of why he's deviant and why he's deviant and why he's deviant. That doesn't do anything for the greater majority, because at the end of the day, the people who are watching this mostly are people who are not knowledgeable about the subject. right? It's the average Muslim who doesn't probably know 70% of what the labels are that's being said, right? And if we feel so passionately that X group is doing this and they're doing this bad, and Y group, Salafi, whatever the case may be, then individually the mosques and the institutes have to come into the 21st century. They have to come and make their versions. They have to get their information out. And I think a lot of this stuff eventually will die down. I think at the end of the day, truth always comes to the surface. Like you mentioned right at the beginning of this episode of entrepreneurs like I have no shyness in saying his name because there's no redeeming factor for him for me, which is Faris Al-Hamadi, Rash's best friend, right? People like him, if you go to his comments now, right, it's people slagging him off left, right, and center. Like, forgive my language, like because at the end of the day, there's only so much you can hide, and there's only so much nefarious activity you can do before Allah makes the truth present, right? And Palestine was just his issue. He came and marketed himself as someone who studied a certain strand of Islam under some big, Salafi scholars, and was answering questions in Q&A, got big. How he got big, where his funding came from, Allah Alim, what that speculation. Right. But his time, I mean, he might still be popular. I don't follow him, so I don't know what his popularity is like right now. But at the end of the day, the truth came forward. When Palestine, a real issue came to town, and it wasn't a case of saying, can I do my trousers have to be above my ankles and not, and all these like rudimentary type of stuff that goes on. His ugly side came out, and and Allah made it clear. So I think there's only so much that these type of like controversial stuff videos do, like in terms of people fighting and the nefarious types and all this stuff. And while they do, I believe, do a disservice to us and these rogue type of elements, everyone having a voice and saying all kinds of stuff, whether it's Mufti Abu Layth and these weird like young the 20-year-olds podcast where they're talking about like marital issues with random people and all that sort of stuff. That's because it's kind of trendy to talk about that stuff, right? Eventually, I believe firmly that people move on from that. And when they move on from that, they need the alternative to then go and find. And I think there are loads of people doing it. And you know what? I think not the trick, but the main thing is you have to focus on, again, the most amount of people you can help with your information, with your work. And that is the general, the average everyday Muslim who doesn't know about the ruling by what Allah has revealed is kufr, and doesn't know about these all complex, very specific issues of belief and what this group and this sect and this sect. And I think that's why on the counter, those type of groups have been the most successful. Yaqeen Institute is probably the biggest Islamic institute in the entire world, right? Why? Because they don't fixate on these type of issues. They focus on the everyday Muslim, the masses, right? Because there's no benefit in focusing on the 1% or the 2%, right? Who are having their, as Imam Shafi said, knowledge of the elite behind the closed doors type of discussions. And you forget about the rest of the ummah who desperately needs help. And what is it? They need help holding on to Islam. They're not debating whether I should be Ash'ari or Maturidi or Salafi or anything like this. They just want to hold on to Islam, right? And there's a lot of people doing a lot of great work. You have Thinking Muslim with his podcast. Yeah, from a UK perspective, you have Sheikh Haytham Al-Haddad who's doing great work. You have Asrar Rashid. In America, you have Dr. Shadi Al-Masri with Safina Society. You have Dr. Yasir Qadi. So we don't have like a shortage of names of like great people doing great work. Now they're not going to get everything right, but I think the ultimate lesson to be learned from is we can have critiques of the scene, rightly so, and there will always be a negative like aspect to every scene. But I think if it's in our power and we have that interest and we want to do it, we have to take initiative, we have to take charge and just produce the material that we want our kids to learn and the general masses to learn as well, inshallah.
I mean, excellent. I'm glad this is effectively the positive note. This is kind of like a good note to discuss towards the end. I mean, basically, the kind of people who actually build for the future, and also the other thing to bear in mind is that how far we have come as a community. As a community before, it was very much culturally focused, fixated with preserving certain culture. Islam was just mostly inherited. As generations have progressed, there's obviously, on the one hand, you see the erosion of cultural Islam, and with that, some level of morality. But at the same time, because of the depth and strength of Islam, people naturally do look for answers. They do naturally start to look, as they grow up, as they mature, they look for an identity. And the West is a good example of, in all this kind of problems that you see in terms of gender, identity, all this kind of stuff, because they're now lost, because they're reaping the ailments of Western society, a society that doesn't have a moral compass. It just purely looks at things materialistically, hedonistically. They are starting to start asking questions. So this actually puts us in a very strong, very important position, I'd say, because not only to preserve our own identity, but to project our identity to Islam to others. That's why, for example, you mentioned 5 pillars. But also, blogging theology, for example, is another important thing as well, because projecting Islam, and probably one of the most important contributions to Aira and Sapiens,
Yeah,
because Dawah is so important. It's almost like if you're in a battle, if you're always on the defensive, it's only a matter of time before you get taken out. If you're on the offensive, you're taking the ideological fight in this sense to them, say, look, this is your point of view, which is why these madrasas. So, for example, one of the statistics they mentioned about 50,000 people being produced in Medina, but you need to put them up to task. They need to be able to go toe to toe with modern ideas. And I mentioned to you once I went to that. I can't find it online because it's possibly the best speech I've heard. Sami Hamdi at Embarking Masjid. I was looking for it. And when I looked at the website for the masjid, a name popped out as one of those people, Sheikh Haytham. I thought to myself, mashallah, he is a brilliant model for us, in a sense that he has so much positive influence on so many different things. And he has this very he has a cross-partisan type of approach. He's not sectarian, there'll be obviously certain lines he won't cross, but he's open to discuss with many different people. So I'm thinking to myself that whereas before you had the divisive elements, how as a community over the years it's progressed, alhamdulillah, better than I could have expected, because Allah's behind it all.
absolutely. And this is two things. I think people feel a level of autonomy now when they research Islam. I think that's one of the benefits that's come from the internet and our handheld devices and all this stuff. Where before, maybe 15, 20 years ago, when you wanted to study Islam, it was your options were pretty narrow, and then it was kind of like a strict formula. And it was kind of like whatever was predominant in your area is kind of what you would learn, because you would go to the resources in your area, whatever movements were about in your area or masjids, and or culturally, what you inherited, and that was it. Where the freedom of the internet has now given people, while again, everything is a double-edged sword, while it can be information overload at times, and it can be hard for the average person to then decipher and kind of work through all the information to see what is the truth, what is not the truth, it still empowers them, right? And I think a great, amazing thing about what's happened with Palestine so far is people feel empowered. They don't feel like it's out of their reach and out of their control. And I think that is something that needs to be taken from not just the political aspect, but into the Islamic learning as well. And you said it right at the beginning, right? Fundamentally, this thing that we're doing now is also a product of everything that we've been talking about, right? And it shows that there is benefit that has come from it and good that's come from it. And the fact that we're trying to do our own version to this shows that there is benefit. And I think it's realizing where the strengths lie in these tools. And I think really emphasizing that autonomy, really making people feel involved in their learning indeed. That it's not you remote, you turn on the TV, sit back and just everything is like spoon fed to you, but they feel involved. Mm-hmm. They feel that, the strength to be able to navigate and look at the different options, look at the different, understandings of what's going on. And then it helps, build that yaqeen almost in themselves.
You also mentioned about Palestine. I mean, look, non-Muslims have learned. Do you remember there's this brother who says, "My soul of my soul," and he has his granddaughter in front of him, and then you see him just stoic, strong. Just that personality there inspired so many Muslims and non-Muslims. Non-Muslims were like doing videos about the phenomena, So, you know, there's a narration which says that if you try to make the people love you, you do things to appease the people, basically, Allah will cause the people to turn against you. I'm paraphrasing here, but if you do things for the sake of Allah, Allah will make the people love you. So there's something about being principled, being like in Palestine. There's a barakah. We're just seeing the start of it. We're just seeing the start of it. Allah has seeded something there. The blood of those martyrs will likely irrigate a revival we've never seen. The West has never seen. The Muslim world has never seen. Because as an ummah, we went through the lowest point intellectually, and now there's a right. Now this, you know, is divine wisdom, but there is a shot of adrenaline here. And as believers, your uncle used to always say this in talks. I always reference your uncle, good old Imam, yeah? He used to say in the issue of Dawah, he said, look, now I'm going to go back to ancient history here. For you, it's going to be like Pathé News in the 45. There's a program called Panorama. He said, look, do you want to be the person who watches Panorama, which is like Newsnight, whatever, and sees a revival happening, or do you want to be the one on Panorama making the revival? And the parallel we have in narration is when Rasulullah was amongst his companions, and he said, my brothers, my brothers, my brothers. The companions said, are we not your brothers? He said, no, you're my Sahaba. My brothers are the ones who will come after you. When they said, basically, when Islam has been neglected, and they will raise it again. And they will have the reward of 50. They said 50 of them? No, 50 of you. Now, this is a powerful incentive for all of us. So now universities, for example, are opening. It's a prime opportunity for these, and I've seen it. In this one masjid, the amount of youth there, you know, like people involved. Like when Uthman Farooq came down, the amount of youth there. This is a prime opportunity. Though some of them may have
another one of the who came up on the online Dawah scene, on the online Dawasphere, right? Sure. For whatever critiques you want to have, you know, of Uthman Farooq and whatever the case may be, and his strong positions, he's still again done a lot of good in terms of his stalls. You know, a lot of people come to Islam, and it shows you when he came to a local masjid how many people attended. I think, yeah, I mean, sometimes it's very easy to get lost in the negative aspects of it and you know, the not so like great things about it in terms of like excessive debate and character assassinations and, you know, all these rebuttal videos. But there's also a lot of good in it, and I think it's a case of taking the good and, you know, and capitalizing on it and just building from there. And inshallah, you know, it will continue, because that's, I feel, how this generation and the following ones are going to really interact with Islam now. It's going to be that connected web of Muslims around the world with issues, and then the information being disseminated in between it. Yeah,
exactly. And I think what the point is from all of this, no matter what the topic is or the discussion or you know, the levels of understanding behind it, if someone as a result of that says, well, what does Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala say about that? What does Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam say about that? If anyone gets involved in any conversation or watches anything and says, well, hang on a second, is that authentic? Is this a personal opinion of a human being? Or is this actually from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala? That pushes them into the right direction, which all of this is the dhikr of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala and the worship of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, and worshipping him the way he commands us to. And all of this is good. You can talk about any topic, and because Islam applies to all situations and all areas and all events, there will always be that opportunity for someone to refer back to Allah or the Rasul. And I think the question behind that, or the development and progress that can be made behind that, is actually confirming that what is being attributed to Allah and to Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam as revelation is confirmed as revelation and not personal opinion.
Absolutely, absolutely. And again, to keep supporting all the people and the institutes that are doing the great work. And I think if you don't allow the negative sides and the fringe sides to elevate themselves, you have to then elevate the ones doing the good, and you have to keep supporting them, keep being vocal about them, and raise them, and then people will be more aware of them, and then the knowledge spreads that way.